Hey guys, tonight we slip into a world of smoky rafters, creaking floorboards, and shelves lined with mysterious jars. You're standing in a medieval kitchen, not the Pinterest kind, but the real deal, where things rot fast, rats are faster, and there's no such thing as a leftover slice of pizza chilling overnight. We're talking about the ancient art of staying fed before refrigeration existed. And spoiler, you probably wouldn't survive this. Picture it. No freezer, no fridge, and definitely no late-night ice cream raids. Food preservation in the Middle Ages was about skill, instinct, and a touch of paranoia. If you didn't know how to keep a cabbage fresh for 6 months or make meat last through a snowstorm, well, let's just say the winter would be long, cold, and remarkably snack-free. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with where you are watching from and what time it is right now. I love seeing how far these sleepy stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open a heavy wooden door set into the stone foundation of a low house. A shallow staircase leads you down into the belly of the earth. A cool, dark cellar lined with rough shelves and deep alcoves. You're immediately struck by the smell: damp stone, root vegetables, a whiff of mildew, and something sweet, almost like old apples. This is no afterthought. The medieval cellar is a food-saving sanctuary. Dug deep to escape the sun's reach, the soil keeps everything just a little cooler than upstairs, like nature's version of that chill drawer in your fridge. You run your fingers along a stack of wooden crates packed with straw. Nestled inside, cabbages, beets, parsnips, and a few onions clinging to their last layers. This is survival, bundled in leaves and roots. In another corner, ceramic jugs and barrels huddle like gossiping monks. Some hold ale or cider, fermented for staying power, while others contain dried beans or preserved fruits. Rats occasionally nibble at the edges, so you notice the peasant trick: hanging sacks from the rafters with string dipped in ash. Clever, a little gross, but effective. Historians still argue whether every household had such storage spaces, or if this was a luxury of better-off peasants. In wetter regions, where basements flooded easily, outdoor earth pits may have substituted. These were often lined with straw or even cooled with snow when available. Not exactly a smart fridge with a touchscreen, but hey, it kept the onions crisp. Quirky detail incoming. In some households, live eels were kept in rain barrels as a food source and weird house guests. When everything else spoiled, eel soup was still on the table. You imagine the midnight chore: scooping a squirming eel from the water while trying not to fall in. Sleep tight. You trace a dusty path from one barrel to another, pausing at a small crate of withered apples. Their skins have gone waxy and soft, but they're still edible, probably headed for a pie if such a thing were even on today's humble menu. That's the trick, really. It wasn't about keeping food fresh. It was about keeping it useful. A small iron lamp flickers in the corner, revealing the ceiling beams above. Herbs hang in bunches from nails: sage, thyme, a little rosemary if someone had luck, or a patron with good taste. You see onions braided into ropes, garlic clusters with dirt still clinging to their roots. Everything is dried, aged, or simply left to do what it does naturally: wait. You pluck a carrot from a pile and snap it in half. Still crisp, still sweet, still better than hunger. The cellar isn't glamorous, it's moldy. It smells a little like despair. But it works. This is food security, medieval style. You feel a strange sense of pride, even as you brush cobwebs from your sleeve. Everything down here is an investment in not starving. Tomorrow, next week, next spring. And let's not forget the ale barrels. Fermentation, as you'll discover in later rooms, is its own kind of preservation. But in cellars like this, ale is life. It's safer than water in many cases, and a lot tastier than boiled cabbage water. One mug of small ale might not get you tipsy, but it'll keep your insides stable enough to get through the day without inviting every germ known to man. There's a clay crock sealed with wax, maybe butter, maybe lard, maybe something no one wants to open. The wax seal is genius, though, airtight-ish and rodent-resistant. You'll come to appreciate beeswax like medieval people appreciated saints, possibly more. Outside, the wind howls faintly through a cracked wooden shutter. You feel the earth's silence pressing in around you. This isn't just food storage. It's a graveyard of growing seasons past. It's also a time capsule of flavor, rot, and ingenuity. You sit on a lumpy burlap sack and breathe in the smell again. It's not pleasant, not really, but it's honest. Everything here was grown, gathered, or brewed with the express purpose of outlasting time. It doesn't care if it looks pretty. It cares if it feeds a family when snow swallows the roads. You think about your own fridge back home. The hum, the lights, the endless supply of sauces you never finish. Here, it's just carrots, ale, and good intentions. And somehow, that's enough. You climb out of the cellar and step into the scullery, where the air is thick with steam and the dull clatter of heavy ceramic bowls. Sunlight trickles in through an oiled parchment window, casting a warm glow over the roughly hewn counters. A wooden spoon rests beside a bubbling pot, and hanging near the fireplace, strips of meat sway like medieval wind chimes. Welcome to the land of salt, the original MVP of medieval food preservation. Salt wasn't just for flavor. It was the lifeline, the pantry staple/health risk that stood between you and spoiled meat. You reach out and run your finger across a salted fish lying stiff on a slab of slate. It smells strong, pungent in a way that whispers, "I'll keep you alive, but I'm not apologizing for how I taste." The process is brutally simple. Cover food in salt, wait, and hope the magic works. Salt draws moisture out, leaving bacteria with nowhere cozy to grow. In colder climates, salted meat could last weeks, even months. Entire hams were salted and hung high in rafters, safe from both vermin and curious children with midnight cravings. Or, at least safer, no guarantees in a house full of mice and desperation. But salt wasn't cheap. If you were lucky, your village might be near a coastal area or a salt spring. Otherwise, you were at the mercy of traders and tithes. Some peasants had to pool resources or rely on community smokehouses instead, saving salt for special cuts or fish caught in bulk during good seasons. Historians still argue whether the average peasant had regular access to salt or whether it remained a semi-precious commodity mostly reserved for preserving game and fish by those who could afford it. Either way, when you did have it, you used it like your life depended on it, because it probably did. A slab of pork hangs from a beam near the hearth, glistening with salt crystals. It looks dry, almost mummified. This is not juicy bacon. This is meat with a survival instinct. Your teeth might struggle, but your stomach won't complain. Now, for the quirky bit. In some places, salt-cured meats were so firm that they had to be soaked for a full day before you could cook them without breaking a tooth. And even then, chewing them could still feel like gnawing a salted boot. It said some folks would simmer salt pork in cabbage water until both were soft enough to pretend they had flavor. Culinary optimism, medieval style. You imagine the scene. A mother unwrapping a salted haunch saved from months earlier, scraping off excess crystals with a dull knife. A child watches eagerly, maybe not even old enough to remember when it was fresh. The smell alone brings a kind of comfort. The promise of meat, even this late in winter, feels like winning the lottery. A very salty, slightly chewy lottery. On a lower shelf you spot another method of preservation. Dry salted fish, packed in tight layers with fistfuls of coarse grains between each fillet. Herring and cod were especially popular, and thanks to the Hanseatic League's trade network, dried fish made its way into even modest inland kitchens. You had to soak it first, yes, but you could travel with it, barter with it, even gift it. In a way, it was medieval jerky, minus the honey glaze. A common recipe, salted fish boiled in ale. Yes, ale. This didn't just rehydrate the fish, it masked the scent of old ocean and questionable storage conditions. Add a few herbs, maybe from the bunches you saw in the cellar, and suddenly, dinner doesn't feel like penance. It feels like success. Still, salt wasn't just for meat. Vegetables could be fermented in brine, which was essentially salty water with attitude. Think early sauerkraut. Cabbage shredded, salted, and left to sour. Some called it a miracle. Others called it a last resort. Either way, it meant greens in winter, and you didn't ask too many questions. You dip a hand into a wooden tub filled with brined cucumbers. Lumpy, soft in spots, but still technically pickles. Not your deli-style crunch, more of a tangy chew, but they count. The fireplace crackles softly, heating stones set along the edge of the hearth. Beside it, a thick slab of smoked and salted cheese rests on a cloth. Yes, cheese could be salted too, though mostly it was aged in cool corners until it hardened into something that could survive travel and time. The richer households might have had wax-sealed rounds or imported wheels, but peasants made do with what milk they could stretch. At some point, someone tosses a handful of salt into a boiling pot. You wonder how many dishes in this house begin with that same gesture. Not for seasoning, really, for insurance. Here is a fun one. Some old kitchens would salt wooden cutting boards to reduce bacterial growth. Did it work? Maybe. Historians still argue whether salt sanitation had any measurable effect beyond superstition. But in an age where invisible threats spoiled entire harvests, no one took chances. You lean back and stare at the wall, where a pair of salted tongues, yes, tongues, hang beside a skein of dried herbs. It's oddly poetic. Salt and thyme, working together like grim old friends, keeping things edible against all odds. Sure, everything tastes a little like the sea, and your dreams might be haunted by chewy pork and pungent fish, but in this kitchen, salt is more than a flavor. It's a lifeline wrapped in grainy white crystals, and tonight, thanks to it, nobody goes hungry. You wander further into the kitchen, where the air changes subtly, less salty, more smoky. The walls are stained with years of soot, and overhead, a blackened beam bears the weight of centuries. Hanging from it, looped with twine and hope, is a collection of meats turned a deep, dusky brown. Welcome to the smoky heart of preservation. Curing with fire and patience. The smokehouse, or sometimes just the hearth, was a vital medieval technology disguised as a lifestyle. You step closer to the fire, where thin ribbons of smoke curl upward, dancing lazily toward the rafters. Here, meat wasn't just cooked. It was baptized in smoke, a ritual that sealed it against the future. You wrinkle your nose. The scent is strong, almost aggressive. If perfume had a forest-themed apocalypse edition, this would be it. Thick cuts of pork, game, even eel were hung and smoked slowly, often over days. The smoke itself acted as both shield and flavor, its compounds inhibiting bacteria and insects while blessing the food with that earthy, resinous tang. You touch one of the strings half expecting it to snap, but the meat is firm, resilient, and slightly sticky, like it's holding on to the last bit of moisture with fierce determination. The key, you notice, is airflow. Medieval homes, especially rural cottages, had open hearths and holes in the ceiling. Not exactly OSHA-compliant, but excellent for turning your entire house into a low-key meat sauna. And while this meant smoky eyes and soot-filled lungs, it also meant protein in February. Historians still argue whether smoking was primarily a peasant technique, or if it was used just as frequently by wealthier estates. What's clear is that in some regions, the communal smokehouse stood as a symbol of collective survival. Whole villages shared the space, often scheduling turns like the world's least appetizing Airbnb. You brush past a rack of sausages strung like medieval garlands. They sway slightly in your passing, each a tube of ambition and leftover bits. These weren't made from filet mignon. more like the last bits scraped off bones, minced with onions, stuffed into intestines, and hung with a prayer. But when smoked, they became gold, or at least something you didn't have to spit out. There's a joke here. What do you call a smoked sausage in winter? Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And the quirks don't stop there. In some remote parts of Northern Europe, folks smoked fish over peat instead of wood. The result? A kind of edible fireplace brick, rich in flavor and vaguely reminiscent of wet socks. Acquired taste, to be sure, but it lasted through lean months, and that was the point. A woman passes by you, carrying a basket of fresh trout. She nods and gestures toward the hearth where the hooks hang ready. Without hesitation, she begins threading the fish through the gills and arranging them with almost ceremonial care. It's a rhythm born of necessity. There's no pause for flavor profiles or artistic plating. This is survival on a string. Sometimes they cold-smoked foods for days without heat, just aromatic haze curling endlessly over the meat like a protective spell. Other times they hot-smoked it over direct flames, sealing in a sort of rough-hewn tenderness. The difference could mean the world depending on your winter plans, or lack thereof. You glance toward a corner where cured hams hang like ancient guardians. They shimmer faintly with fat, stiff yet oddly elegant. One of them even bears a burnished emblem, a family crest pressed into the flesh with a heated iron. Branding dinner wasn't just for fun, it was proof that this meat was yours, and woe to anyone who tried to claim it. And then there's the cheese smoke crossover. In some areas, hard cheeses were lightly smoked to extend their life. The effect? A snack that tasted like a barn fire, but in a good way if you were cold and had run out of root vegetables. Of course, not all smoke was welcome. Sometimes the wood was damp or the meat too close to the flames. Ever heard of creosote bacon? It's exactly what it sounds like. Meat that tastes like a chimney sweep-esque glove. But even then, better charred than spoiled. In your hand you hold a thin sliver of smoked venison. It's leathery but rich. A medieval energy bar, no plastic wrapper, just time and tradition. You chew slowly, listening to the distant clink of pots and the quiet crackle of flame. It's not delicious, but it's real, grounding. This is food that remembers its purpose. The longer you stay near the smoke, the more it clings to you. Your clothes, your skin, even your hair. You're becoming part of the process, like one more ingredient hung to dry, and there's a charm to it. In a world without refrigeration, smoke became flavor, storage, preservation, and ritual. It turned food into memory. Each bite a reminder that someone, somewhere, decided not to give up. Tonight, your dinner might smell like a campfire and chew like an old boot, but it won to kill you. And that, in the medieval kitchen, is what passes for luxury. You slip away from the smoky hearth, eyes stinging ever so slightly, and find yourself drifting toward the quiet corners of the kitchen where something curious happens. Not quite drying, not quite cooking, but something in between. You crouch beside a simple wooden table, and that's when you see them. Fat clay crocks and glassless jars, some sealed with wax, others covered with cloth and string. Inside, a time capsule of vegetables, fruits, and roots bobbing in mysterious brines. Welcome to the world of pickling and fermenting, medieval edition. This isn't your trendy modern-day kombucha corner. This is preservation with attitude, sharp, acidic, and sometimes unapologetically fizzy. You lift a lid and immediately regret it. A pungent aroma shoots straight into your nose, making your eyebrows consider retirement. Ah yes, sauerkraut, or rather the rough ancestor of it. Fermented cabbage, layered with salt and mashed down under stones to force out liquid and invite good bacteria to throw a fermentation party. You didn't RSVP, but you're here now. In medieval kitchens, pickling was one of the most effective ways to preserve produce, especially in winter. Salt was crucial. When mixed with vegetables, it created an environment unfriendly to the bad bacteria and inviting to the good. The result was crunchy, sour, and surprisingly nutritious. Vitamin C? Check. Gut health? You bet. Taste? Let's just say it was an acquired acidity. Historians still argue whether early medieval fermentation practices were more influenced by Roman methods or if they emerged organically from isolated peasant customs. Either way, every region had its own favorite acidic gamble. One croft in northern England might preserve turnips in brine so sour it could strip paint. Meanwhile, a Slavic household tucked cabbage leaves into oak barrels with garlic, carrots, and, sometimes bafflingly, juniper berries. And if you think that's weird, picture this: pickled walnuts, green, unripe, and soaked until they looked like shrunken dragon eyes. Supposedly delicious, though you're not convinced. You wipe your hands after inspecting a greasy wax seal. Inside is preserved meat. Yes, they pickled meat too. Pork soaked in vinegar, herbs, and sometimes wine. When famine loomed, you could haul out a pickle barrel, spear something vaguely edible, and live to complain about it. And it wasn't just vinegar or brine. There was also verjuice, a sour juice made from unripe grapes or crab apples. Tart and tangy, it doubled as a cooking ingredient and a preserving agent. You dip your finger in one of the crocks and give it a cautious taste. It's like your tongue was insulted, slapped, and then apologized to, all at once. One quirk about medieval fermentation: they didn't always know why it worked. They noticed food stopped spoiling, sure, but the bacterial science behind lacto-fermentation, that was still hundreds of years away. So what did they do? They got superstitious. Some believed whispering prayers over the jars helped. Others hung charms above barrels to keep the rot away. You imagine a medieval housewife glaring down a bubbling crock while holding a garlic necklace like it as holy water. And speaking of prayers, let's not forget fermented fish sauce. Yes, it was a thing. In parts of Scandinavia and even the Low Countries, people made an early version of garum by letting fish sit in barrels with salt until it basically liquefied. Historians still argue whether this was a delicacy or a dare. Regardless, it made its way into stews, broths, and even used as medicine. You sniff one barrel cautiously. Bold of you. Now your nose may never recover. Pickled eggs also made an appearance, especially around monasteries. Hard-boiled, then soaked in spiced vinegar, they were favored by monks for their longevity and for making other people go away quickly when opened. You spot a child placing small, wax-sealed jars of berries into a root cellar hatch. Fruit preservation through fermentation was delicate business. Gooseberries, elderberries, even crab apples were sometimes gently fermented with honey into something bordering on wine, but more often ended up as tangy mush that tasted faintly of regret and desperation. But hey, in a February with no apples, you were grateful. The textures in this part of the kitchen are fascinating. There's the crunch of salt-preserved carrots, the slippery softness of pickled onions, and the uncertain wobble of fermented dairy. Yes, they fermented milk too. Think of it like early yogurt or clabber, where raw milk sat in a warm spot and curdled politely over time. You take a sniff and pull back. It smells like someone's laundry day collided with a goat parade. But in terms of nutrition, all this strange fermenting and pickling worked wonders. These were probiotic powerhouses centuries before anyone invented the term. They kept people alive during plague winters and bread shortages, and gave peasants the closest thing to salad dressing they'd ever taste. Fermentation had its superstitions, but also its techniques. Some families passed down their brine like heirlooms. The same crock of pickling juice might be reused for decades, with legends claiming better flavor with every batch. Old vinegar makes brave men, one saying went, though historians still argue whether that was metaphor or marinade. You kneel near a barrel labeled with rough initials. It's sealed tightly, marked with soot. A woman approaches, nods to you, and gently knocks 3 times before unsealing the lid. Just a tradition, maybe. Or maybe, in a world full of spoilage, a little superstition never hurt. In all its pucker and sting, fermentation isn't glamorous. It's not spicy or sizzling or plated with edible flowers. But it is honest. It's food made to last through hardship, to fill bellies when fields are barren, and to challenge the modern palate with flavors we forgot to love. You take one last sniff, ginger, vinegar, and something unnameable, and step back. Your mouth tingles, your eyes water, and deep inside your gut nods in approval. You step outside, just briefly, into the quiet morning of a medieval courtyard where the fog hugs the ground like a sleepy dog. Cold air rushes your face, and suddenly you understand why people preserved food so obsessively. Winter wasn't just chilly, it was an open-ended siege. You head back inside to where preservation gets a little smoky. Literally. You walk through a narrow hallway that smells like campfire and history. It leads to a separate stone outbuilding. Half kitchen, half smokehouse. A rack of meats hangs from the rafters, slow smoking in coils of gray mist. You tilt your head up, and the ceiling looks like it's been painted in soot. Centuries of grease and smoke, layer upon quiet layer. Welcome to smoking and drying, the medieval answer to the fridge. Smoking was essential not just for flavor, but for survival. Salt cured and then smoked over smoldering hardwood, meats like bacon, hams, and sausages could last for weeks, even months. The science? Heat dries out moisture, and the smoke itself contains antimicrobial compounds. The result? Something tough, chewy, and vaguely resembling food if you squint, and a blessing when your bread is just barley mush. You pick up a dried sausage, hard as a wooden spoon. It smells divine, peppery, smoky, and somehow hopeful. Now, drying wasn't limited to meat. You spot bundles of herbs dangling from rafters like upside-down bouquets. Sage, rosemary, thyme. Next to them, slices of apples strung up on twine, curling like shrunken moons. Mushrooms, too, dried to the texture of old leather. Some families even dried cheese, though it ended up more like a medieval protein brick than anything resembling brie. Historians still argue whether the earliest smokehouses were communal or private. Some believe entire villages shared a central smoker, while others insist each household carved out a niche to avoid interfamily meat borrowing. And if you've ever accused someone of borrowing your smoked goose, you understand how medieval feuds started. You look around the structure. No chimney, just a vent. This lets smoke linger longer, forcing its essence deep into whatever's hung above. Sometimes they'd burn sawdust or peat moss for specific flavors. Other times, bark or herbs were tossed in. Lavender smoke deal? Why not? The process could take days. Long, low fires had to be tended with saintly patience. Imagine your medieval self crouched beside glowing embers at 3 a.m., muttering curses because your pork started sweating instead of smoking. But still you'd wait. Because come February, when everything else is mold or mush, your smoked leg of mutton would be the household MVP. Quirk alert. In some Germanic regions, people smoked eggs. Yes, eggs. Boiled, peeled, and then left in smoky heat until they turned tan and tasted, let's say, intense. You try to imagine peeling that in a hurry while fleeing a peasant revolt. Meat wasn't always available, though, so they smoked fish. A lot of it. Herring especially. Hung in rows until they resembled salty curtains. The smell was powerful. You pass one such rack and it's like being slapped by Poseidon's armpit. But for a peasant, smoked fish was protein, salt, and calories in a single stinky bite. And the drying process could get even more creative. In southern regions, fruits were sun-dried on roof tiles. Dates, plums, figs. Imagine scrambling up to your thatched roof, carefully placing apricot slices like edible shingles, only to have a goat knock them all off. Yes, goats again, always ruining something. One fringe tidbit? In medieval Iceland, they'd dry shark meat by burying it and letting it ferment, then hanging it to dry in the cold wind. Historians still argue whether this was genius or a long-running prank on tourists. The result, Hakarl, is so pungent that even today it's considered a rite of passage food. You take a cautious breath and decide Icelanders were either very brave or completely out of food ideas. Back to the kitchen smokehouse, someone hands you a bundle of dried nettles. Not just for tea. Dried nettles could be rehydrated into soup greens. And don't scoff at soup greens when your choices are that or licking a rock for minerals. You watch a young apprentice grind dried mushrooms into powder. This poor man's seasoning could make dull stews taste richer, earthy, meaty, with a touch of forest floor. It's not truffle oil, but in the absence of flavor packets or spice mixes, it's enough to turn mush into a meal. Now here is a quirky observation. Dried foods often had names far more poetic than they deserved. Winter's fruit, sunbark, cloud mutton. The reality. Dried apple slices, dried fish, and dried beef strips. But even peasants knew branding mattered. When all you're eating is gray porridge, you cling to the idea that your rehydrated apple leather is a delicacy. Drying and smoking made food not just preservable, but portable. Travelers, soldiers, and pilgrims packed jerky-like meats and dried vegetables into satchels, the original snack to go. No wrappers, no plastic, just a cloth pouch and a hopeful attitude. As you turn to leave, you spot a child chewing on a dried plum like it's candy. No sugar coating, no fancy glazing, just fruit, tough as tree bark, but surprisingly sweet after a few minutes of gnawing. You reach for one and try it. It's not amazing, but it's comforting. Like a memory of sunshine hidden in a shriveled skin. And maybe that's the point. These methods, smoking, drying, they weren't just about survival. They were about saving the essence of summer, locking it in wood and fire and time so that when the world turned cold and colorless, you could still taste something golden. You step outside again, carrying that warmth in your mouth. The fog hasn't lifted, but inside your coat pocket, a strip of dried venison, and the knowledge that sometimes smoke is stronger than snow. Back inside the manor kitchen, you pass a row of wooden barrels pressed up against a stone wall like sleepy old men. Each one is sealed tight, though the tops are crusted with white residue and smell faintly of, well, tangy rot. Welcome to fermentation, where medieval food met friendly bacteria and everyone just hoped for the best. You kneel beside one of the barrels and open the lid. A noseful of sour air hits you immediately, sharp enough to water your eyes. Inside, chopped cabbage swimming in brine, not so different from modern sauerkraut, but chunkier and decidedly funkier. The kitchen mistress tells you it's been in there for a month and a half, just long enough to turn from leaf to life-giving sour sludge. Hey, you weren't getting vitamin C from oranges in winter, right? Fermentation wasn't just trendy, it was practical magic. It kept food safe from spoiling, added flavor, and improved nutrition. Some scholars argue it was the original probiotic, keeping guts working in an era without plumbing or privacy. Historians still argue whether fermentation was discovered by accident or by watching how animals buried and unearthed food. Either way, you owe your winter digestion to it. And cabbage wasn't alone in this process. You stroll past a second barrel, this one bubbling faintly. Root vegetables, chopped and mixed with vinegar and herbs. Fermented turnips, spicy, sour, and oddly addictive. The kind of thing you'd refuse at first, then crave 2 weeks into January when your palate is dying of boredom. There's even a jug labeled ale soup starter. A mix of barley, hops, wild yeast, and vague hope. The cook explains they'd sometimes ferment grains with herbs to make a vaguely beer-flavored porridge. Not quite Guinness, not quite oatmeal, let's call it a beverage you have to chew. You spot a row of glazed ceramic crocks on the shelf. Some are capped with wax-sealed cloth. Others are open, bubbling with a white froth that looks deeply suspicious. But inside, pickled eggs, garlic cloves, preserved onions. The vinegar smells bitey, but clean. These were staples, sharp, long-lasting, and capable of cutting through bland gruel like medieval hot sauce. Oddest of all, there's a wooden bowl of what looks like gooey cheese left to its own devices. This, they whisper, is a soured milk starter. Medieval folk would sometimes let milk sit until it separated into curds and whey, then mix that with herbs and press it into small cheeses. Aged for a few days, they became spreadable, tangy, and entirely questionable. Sometimes they molded it into little shapes, hearts, animals, or spirals. Your ancestors had time on their hands. One corner holds an experimental batch of fermented fish. You do not get closer. Apparently, in coastal villages, they'd bury small fish in barrels with a pinch of salt and wait until nature took its unsettling course. The result was a proto-garum, Roman-style fish sauce, used sparingly, very sparingly, like one drop or you'll regret it sparingly. Fermentation also had cultural and spiritual importance. In monasteries, brewing beer was not just a survival, it was salvation. The beer monks made was safer to drink than water and stored for months. Monks became fermentation scientists before the term even existed. Some even had secret recipes locked away in drawers. Or, at least that see in the legend, historians still argue whether monks invented the first truly controlled fermentation. Now, here's a quirk you can forget. Some folks used fermentation as a form of social currency. In German-speaking regions, certain fermented dishes, especially pickled pears and turnips, were brought to weddings as gifts. Imagine bringing a jar of funky tubers to a bridal shower today. You'd be uninvited and probably arrested. You lift a ceramic lid and sniff cautiously. Fermented honey and herbs. It smells like a cross between mead and forest floor. This, they say, was a cure-all. Rubbed on wounds, stirred into teas, or drunk in desperate gulps when the midwinter blues hit hard. They called it sweet rot, and depending on your optimism, it was either medicine or misery. Fermentation, in its own musty, gurgling way, was one of the few medieval food tricks that required very little effort but gave back so much. It turned bland staples into zingy miracles. It made your pantry stretch deeper into the dark months. And, perhaps most important, it offered a little bit of surprise. Each jar was its own experiment. Each sip or spoonful was a dare. You imagine yourself, on a frosty night, curled by the hearth with a hunk of hard bread and a tiny clay bowl of fermented turnips. They sting the tongue, wake up your senses, and remind you that life, despite its many failures, is still trying. And isn't that the theme of medieval food preservation? A constant, clumsy effort to outwit time, to hold on to summer, to keep death slightly less interested in dinner. You seal the lid, set the jar back in its cradle, and move on. The air is still sharp with vinegar, but it smells like resourcefulness now. Like old kitchens and quiet rebellions. You won't crave these dishes in a modern sense, but tonight you respect them. You honor the fact that people lived, laughed, and somehow fermented their way through history. In the colder corner of the kitchen, stone walls damp with condensation and shadows thick like spilled ink, you find another essential trick of the medieval survival playbook: root cellaring. And no, it's not glamorous. You're not about to uncover any forgotten delicacies or artisanal secrets. You're about to look at holes. Very well-organized holes. See, without refrigeration, peasants and nobles alike relied heavily on the earth itself to preserve their food. Below your feet, under trapdoors or buried beneath outbuildings, were cellar spaces dug deep to harness the natural cool and damp. Temperatures here hover just above freezing in winter and stay blessedly steady in summer, which might explain why you haven't seen a single carrot in the yard. They're all down here, snoozing in the dirt. You climb down a creaking ladder, lantern in hand, and immediately feel it. The air is colder, moist, with a hint of mushroomy sweetness. Shelves line the walls, stacked with baskets of apples, onions, and parsnips so gnarly they look like shrunken trolls. Some are buried in layers of sand or straw. Why? Because moisture is both friend and enemy. Enough keeps the roots from shriveling. Too much, and welcome to Mold City. Historians still argue whether medieval folks fully understood humidity control or just stumbled into it through grim experience. Either way, they figured out that storing vegetables separately, upright, and with air circulation kept things edible long past their natural deadline. Your guide gestures to a long wooden trough. Inside, potatoes, or what pass for medieval potatoes, wrapped in linen and nestled in dried moss. They're not true potatoes yet. Those only came from the Americas later. But Europe had its own earthy crowd. Skirrets, turnips, Jerusalem artichokes, and salsify. All bland, all starchy, and all quietly waiting in the dark like subterranean loyalists. Some cellars even had primitive ventilation, tiny slits carved near the ceiling and floor to allow slow airflow. Others were filled with charcoal bowls to reduce odor. A few more elite setups had stone tiles to absorb and release moisture depending on the season. All of this just so you could eat a slightly bendy carrot in February. One surprising item that shows up here? Apples. Not the shiny store-bought kind, but small, hard ones bred for storage. Medieval people would select specific apple types, like costards or pearmains, because they aged well in cellars. These weren't dessert fruits. These were, if you're lucky, you can chew this in April apples. And pears, stored in dry ashes. Yes, ashes from the hearth. The theory, and it mostly worked, was that ashes absorbed moisture and kept bugs at bay. Imagine opening a barrel of soot just to retrieve a pear. It's not glamorous, but hey, it beats scurvy. You notice bundles of dried herbs hanging from ceiling hooks. Sage, rosemary, thyme. They weren't just for cooking. Some were pest repellents. Some were thought to ward off evil spirits, and you're not convinced that distinction was always clear. A few bundles of dried lavender hang nearby too, perhaps for masking the smell of increasingly suspicious root vegetables. Or maybe for dreams. People believed sleeping near lavender kept nightmares at bay, so it doubled as an air freshener and a medieval knee quill. A child scrambles past with a bundle of straw and a tiny spade. She is going to refill the turnip bin, which has started to smell too alive. That's the danger of root cellaring. It's low effort, high maintenance. If one vegetable starts to rot, it's like a high school rumor. The rest join in almost overnight. There's a fringe theory that some medieval folk buried their root vegetables in the fields during winter, layering them with straw and digging up only what they needed. Like nature's own fridge. That may sound smart until you realize snow, rain, and hungry boars don't respect your pantry boundaries. Still, for all the risk and labor, root cellars were the heart of winter survival. They offered a taste of past seasons, sweet parsnips from late autumn, onions cured from midsummer, and even cabbages that somehow endured the whole circus. And when meat was scarce and bread was hard, these humble holdovers filled bellies and bought time. But let's not over-romanticize. These were not crisp, fresh bites. They were limp, bitter, sometimes frost-bitten chunks of hope. But they were something. You didn't eat for flavor, you ate to see spring again. And maybe that's the quiet nobility of the cellar. It doesn't dazzle or impress, it just endures. It holds on. It makes the future possible. One grimy carrot at a time. You climb back up the ladder, hands dusty with straw and soil, nose tingling with the scent of sage and onion. Your shoulders ache a little. Your eyes blink in the kitchen's lantern light. The world above seems louder now, faster. But the cellar still hums under your feet, full of patient, starchy miracles. The sun may be low and the hearth nearly spent, but your journey through this medieval kitchen is far from over. You inch toward a strange wooden barrel tucked behind the hearth, sealed tight with wax and resin around the edges. Your nose wrinkles. It smells intense, sharp, tangy, a little like wet socks dipped in vinegar and left in the sun. Congratulations, you've just discovered the noble art of fermentation. Before refrigeration, fermentation wasn't a quirky artisan hobby. It was a full-blown survival tactic. Pickling wasn't just for cucumbers. Everything from cabbage to fish, even milk, was fair game. And in a time where a hard frost could wipe out your food supply, every edible scrap was either fermented, smoked, dried, or buried in salt like it owed money. You pry open the barrel, and inside is sauerkraut, or its medieval cousin, finely shredded cabbage packed with salt and left to fester into a tart, crunchy miracle. It's surprisingly edible looking. Sour, yes, but tangy and bright in a way that feels like defiance in the dead of winter. Historians still argue whether Germanic tribes learned the practice from Chinese laborers along ancient trade routes, or whether cabbage simply has an independent flair for drama. Whatever the origin, this dish packed a nutritional punch, vitamin C in a sea of bread and sadness. Sailors would later carry it across oceans to ward off scurvy, but long before that, peasants relied on its acidic backbone to survive harsh seasons. Next to the cabbage is another barrel, this one darker, with something floating in a murky brine. Eggs? You lean closer. Yep, eggs. Preserved in lime water or sometimes even wood ash slurry. The alkaline mix hardened the shells and stopped bacterial growth, turning fragile ovals into time capsules. Modern palates may recoil, but back then this was gold. One egg meant one more day with energy to split firewood, dig trenches, or survive a tax collector's visit. Now you reach for a tightly sealed jug near the edge of a shelf, the wax cap cracked just enough to tempt curiosity. Inside is mead. Not the golden, romanticized mead of Viking feasts, but a modest, peasant's version made from honey dregs and wild yeast caught in the breeze. It's cloudy, unpredictable, and sometimes explosive. One too many gas bubbles and your ceramic jug goes airborne like a medieval soda bottle. Still, the mild alcohol made it safer to drink than water, and its natural preservatives extended shelf life. Children would often drink watered-down versions, and some historians even debate whether early meads had medicinal uses, though, let's be honest, a tipsy toddler was probably more accident than intention. Moving along the shelf, you find what looks like a stiff block of waxy leather. But no, it's preserved meat, salted, dried, then packed in fat, a technique called confit. Originating in France, yes, but adopted elsewhere in different forms. Duck legs, rabbit, or even pork belly submerged in their own rendered fat and left in earthen pots. The fat acted like a medieval Tupperware lid, sealing out air and bacteria. You poke the surface with a wooden spoon and see the layer of fat give way, revealing grayish meat below. It's not winning any Michelin stars. But when spring was still a dream and nothing green had poked through the earth, this oily relic meant everything. Some families even preserved dairy, turning milk into hard cheeses that could last months, or sour curds stored in brine, sometimes called clabber. Think cottage cheese, but chunkier, and probably with a name like Bessie's Blessing. You wrinkle your nose, but nod in respect. These people turned perishables into patience. Then there's garum, or its northern cousin, alec, fermented fish sauce, made by layering fish guts with salt and leaving it under pressure until it liquefied into a brown, umami-rich ooze. Historians still argue whether garum in medieval Europe was truly the same as the Roman version, or just inspired by tales from cookbooks passed through monasteries. Either way, the result was pungent, potent, and apparently irresistible. A single splash could transform bland barley mush into something, if not delicious, then at least distractingly weird. At this point, you're wondering how anyone in this kitchen had functioning noses. The smells must have been constant, like a perfume shop run by gremlins. But the stench was the smell of survival: brine, vinegar, whey, and garlic. There's a basket of garlic ropes hanging above your head, braided and swinging with each shift of air. Garlic helped preserve food, yes, but also was believed to ward off illness, demons, and in-laws. Jars of mustard seeds line the back wall, crushed into pungent paste that, besides flavoring bland porridges, acted as a preservative in its own right. And finally, the true surprise, pickled fruit. Not just for novelty, but to keep sweetness on the table long after the orchard gave up. Plums, pears, even cherries were packed in sour brine or honeyed vinegar, transforming into acidic gems. Some recipes used cinnamon or cloves, long-distance travelers from spice routes. These little jars were prized, stored high, gifted to monasteries, or traded for favors. So here you stand, surrounded by barrels, jars, and jugs. None of them labeled, all of them suspicious. And yet, each is a quiet testament to human ingenuity. To survive, you had to get comfortable with decay. You had to trust time. And you had to ignore your nose. You step back, the taste of vinegar somehow clinging to your imagination, and your eyes adjust once more to the warm flicker of firelight. The kitchen isn't glamorous, but it's stubborn. It endures. There's a muffled squeak behind you, and a shadow darts along the rafters. Don't worry, it's probably just a rat. Or 3. They live here too, you know. And for all the effort medieval kitchens put into preserving food, they didn't always win the war against tiny, whiskered adversaries. But you shake that thought off as you notice something even more intriguing. An open alcove built right into the thick stone wall. It's cool to the touch, and the air inside smells faintly of damp earth and herbs. Welcome to the poor man's refrigerator, the larder. No humming machines, no blinking lights, just careful architecture. Thick walls, shaded placement, and, when possible, a location underground or on the north side of a house. Some wealthier homes even had ice pits, where blocks of winter-harvested ice were packed in straw and buried. Historians still argue whether such ice storage methods were widespread among the peasantry or more localized to noble estates. But either way, the principle was clear. When it's cool, food lasts longer. You crouch low, peering into the stone alcove. There's salted meat hung like laundry, coils of dried sausages strung with rosemary, and baskets of apples, the hearty, late-harvest kind that could last for months if stored carefully and turned every week. One bruised apple was a gateway drug for mold. You pluck a sausage string off the hook. It's stiff, almost fossilized, salted beyond reason, spiced with whatever was on hand, probably mustard seed, maybe marjoram if someone had relatives in town. This was a staple. Dried sausage offered protein in a time when chickens were more valuable alive than fried. At the very back of the larder, behind some crocks of aging cheese, and what may or may not be a turnip-shaped rock, you spot something curious. A netted sack of nuts. Walnuts, hazelnuts, hard-shelled treasures that kept for ages and offered oil, fat, and calories during lean seasons. You crack one open on a nearby stone and taste a fragment of history. It's stale, sure, but if you squint hard enough you can pretend it's artisanal. Some families would go one step further and bury food. Yes, bury. Root vegetables. Turnips, carrots, parsnips, kept astonishingly well if stored in sand-lined barrels and tucked underground. You'd dig a pit, layer in straw, pack it with produce, and pray your neighbors didn't help themselves. Scholars still debate whether communal pits ever existed, or if each family jealously guarded their own underground vault like edible treasure. You imagine winter creeping in, snow blanketing the countryside, and the only thing standing between you and hunger is a forgotten hole behind the pig shed. Sleep tight, indeed. On the other end of the kitchen you see a worn clay bottle covered in soot. Someone's been using it for generations. You tip it, and a viscous brown liquid clings to the mouth. Vinegar. Another unsung hero. Not just for pickling. Vinegar disinfected surfaces, dressed tired greens, and warded off flies when splashed around windows. There were even superstitions that vinegar could trap evil spirits or cure melancholy if inhaled aggressively enough. Don't try that. You spot a cluster of fabric bundles tied with string. You tug one open. Dried herbs, of course, lavender, sage, thyme. But some bundles contain something more pungent: dried mushrooms. Some are edible, others, well, let's just say medieval foragers didn't always get it right. One wrong fungus and your cozy stew turned into a spiritual awakening, or a very sleepy funeral. And yet, people took the risk because drying mushrooms was one of the only ways to store earthy umami when meat was scarce. The ceiling of the kitchen, blackened with years of soot, still plays its role in food preservation. Up there, bundles of meat and fish hang in slow sacrifice to smoke. Cold smoking was common, meat exposed to the cool, aromatic vapors of a smoldering fire without actually cooking. This gave it flavor and kept it from going bad too quickly. And as a bonus, it made the entire kitchen smell like a medieval barbecue pit, which, depending on your level of optimism, was either mouth-watering or migraine-inducing. You step back and admire the interplay of techniques. There's no single method, no magic bullet. Preservation was a game of layers. You salted your fish, then smoked it, then stored it in a cool place, then prayed, because one slip, a wet cloth, a cracked jar, a warm week, and the whole batch spoiled. It was a constant dance between planning and luck, between knowing your environment and not being too proud to borrow from your neighbor's success, or their spice rack. Oh yes, spices. Even in a modest home, you might find a dusty pouch of something exotic: peppercorns, cloves, maybe even a nub of dried ginger. Spices were expensive but traded widely. A single ounce of black pepper could be worth a day's wages. But it wasn't just about flavor. Many spices had antimicrobial properties, which made them invaluable for preserving stews, sauces, and meats, even if just in small amounts. And here, perhaps the most humble preservation method of all: hunger. You didn't store what you ate immediately. You didn't eat what you could store. The best preservation method was simply not needing the food today. You lived with an instinct honed over centuries. Don't waste, don't rush, and always think 3 seasons ahead. With one last glance at the larder, you close the wooden door. The latch creaks into place. In the quiet, you hear the house settle around you. The hum of preservation continues. The drip of brine, the crackle of embers, the cool hush of still air. You step outside into the cold morning air, where the smell of wood smoke still lingers from last night's hearth. Just beyond the kitchen, there's the root cellar, a stone-lined pit dug deep into the earth. This is another fortress of freshness, where medieval people tucked away the season's harvest to outwit time itself. You crouch at the edge and peer inside. Rows of turnips, carrots, parsnips, and cabbages lie packed in straw like sleeping soldiers, waiting for their moment to feed hungry mouths. Root cellars were a marvel of medieval ingenuity. The earth's natural insulation kept temperatures steady just above freezing, perfect for storing vegetables that might rot above ground in weeks. Humidity was another factor. Too dry and carrots shriveled. Too damp and everything turned to mush. So straw, sand, and wooden slats were carefully layered to strike the balance. You run your fingers over a turnip's rough skin, cold and firm. This was survival. Historians still argue whether root cellars were common in all parts of medieval Europe, or if they were more a feature of colder northern climates. Some evidence suggests that wealthier estates had elaborate, sometimes multi-room cellars, while peasants used simpler pits, sometimes just holes lined with stones and covered with earth. You imagine a family huddled near the entrance, rationing their root vegetables through winter, each meal a victory against scarcity. Inside the cellar, you find something unusual: a wooden box with holes drilled in its sides. It's a primitive refrigerator for eggs. Medieval folks discovered that keeping eggs cool and ventilated delayed spoilage. The box likely contained straw or sawdust as cushioning. You can almost hear the gentle clucking of hens nearby, a reminder that the best preservation was having fresh supplies daily, not just stored goods. Outside the cellar, a small herb garden thrives near the kitchen door. Not just for flavor, these herbs had preservation uses too. Rosemary branches wrapped around meats before smoking helped repel insects and bacteria. Sage and thyme were sprinkled into stews to keep them from turning sour quickly. Some herbal concoctions even doubled as early antiseptics, applied to wounds or used to clean utensils. You pause by a shallow trench filled with water, an ancient icebox. In winter, villagers would harvest blocks of ice from nearby ponds and pack them in straw in this trench, where they slowly melted but kept food cold. It's an early form of refrigeration, albeit unpredictable and seasonal. Historians debate how widespread this practice was among common folk versus elites, but the ingenuity speaks for itself. Walking back toward the kitchen, you notice a pile of ashes near the hearth. Ashes might seem like waste, but they had a surprising role in preservation. People rubbed ashes on vegetables like turnips and carrots to deter pests during storage. Ash was also used in soap making and sometimes to dry clean wool or fabrics, keeping clothing and kitchen linens fresher longer. You spy an odd ceramic jar with a narrow neck and a heavy lid. Inside is honey, the ultimate preservative. Honey's natural acidity and low moisture content make it almost immortal. It preserved fruit, sealed wounds, and sweetened food when sugar was a luxury. Archaeologists have found honey jars in tombs thousands of years old, still perfectly edible. It was the medieval pantry's golden guardian. The kitchen hearth crackles behind you, a comforting sound in a world without electricity or running water. You imagine the rhythm of the day, the fire stoked for cooking, for warmth, for smoking fish, for drying herbs. You imagine the people, women mostly, carefully tending these processes knowing that their family's survival depended on mastering every method of preservation. And yet, despite all these techniques, root cellars, smoke, salt, herbs, ice, honey, food still spoiled. It was a daily gamble. Every household became a scientist of sorts, experimenting with recipes, timing, and combinations. They learned to read signs, the smell of souring milk, the texture of wilting greens, the color of fading fruit. Their kitchens were laboratories, their tables battlefields. The peculiar mixture of smells, smoke, earth, salt, herbs, fills the air. It's not what you'd call appetizing now, but it was home. The sensory tapestry of a life balanced between scarcity and plenty, between the seasons and the pantry. You take a deep breath, letting the cool, smoky kitchen air settle in your lungs. This is how medieval kitchens preserved food, with patience, resourcefulness, and a dash of hope. You lean closer to the hearth's embers, where the last glow of the fire flickers like a dying star. Tonight, you're diving into the art of drying, the simplest, oldest method of preservation. Imagine you're a medieval cook with nothing but sun, wind, and fire at your disposal. You slice fruits, herbs, and even meat into thin strips, then lay them out on woven mats or wooden racks, letting nature do the hard work. Sun drying was the go-to for many foods in warmer parts of Europe. You feel the imagined heat on your skin as you picture plums, apples, and pears, all shrinking under the relentless sun, their sugars concentrating into sticky, sweet treasures. Dried fruit lasted for months, a precious energy source during bleak winters. It also made a decent treat. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of candy, without the neon colors. But drying wasn't limited to fruit. You spot a rack of thinly sliced fish hanging over the fire. Smoking and drying often worked hand in hand, especially for preserving fish and game. Smoke added flavor, yes, but it was also a powerful preservative, thanks to chemicals like formaldehyde and phenols in the wood smoke. Your nose wrinkles at the thought of smoked herrings hanging from rafters, but medieval noses were tough and used to stronger smells. Historians still argue whether all medieval households had the luxury of dedicated drying sheds, or if this was mostly a practice of wealthier estates. Archaeological digs have uncovered drying racks in castles and manor houses, but in peasant homes, sometimes it was just strings and sticks near the hearth or outside walls. Either way, it's clear drying was vital. Then there's the quirky side of drying. Some medieval cooks dried flowers, lavender, rose petals, violets, not just for their scent, but sometimes as edible decorations or mild flavorings in desserts and drinks. This is one of those delightful oddities where cooking and cosmetics overlap. Who knew that your granny's potpourri habit had medieval roots? You remember the smoky smell from the last section and realize drying with fire created a complex sensory environment. Smoke, heat, and wind mingled to preserve food, but also made kitchens aromatic and sometimes overwhelming places. If you've ever burned your toast and sworn off cooking for the day, imagine doing that every meal and still having to eat it. Drying wasn't perfect, of course. If the weather turned rainy or humid, food could mold or spoil faster than expected. So cooks had to be vigilant, sometimes redrying foods or moving them inside. The unpredictability meant drying was as much an art as a science, requiring experience and a good sense of timing. You pick up a handful of dried herbs, thyme, sage, and rosemary, from a small basket. These herbs didn't just flavor food, drying them preserved their medicinal properties too. Medieval households often grew herbs both for cooking and healing. A pinch of dried thyme might keep the cough at bay, while rosemary helped memory and mood. You think about how intertwined food and medicine were back then. One big, overlapping toolkit. Finally, you spot dried cheese, a surprising preservation technique. Hard cheeses like Parmesan or aged cheddar were left out to dry slightly, forming a protective rind that kept bacteria out. This extended their shelf life and added complex flavors. Though cheese was mostly for the wealthier classes, some form of drying or aging was common in villages. All this drying, smoking, and layering of flavors created a cuisine far more interesting than the boring history tag you started with. It was a balancing act of survival, experimentation, and cultural traditions, passed down through generations. As the fire dies down, you let your thoughts drift to the faint crackling of dried herbs in the breeze and the sweet, smoky tang of preserved food, a sensory lullaby from centuries ago. You step back into the dim kitchen where shadows dance off stone walls, and your eyes land on barrels and jars lining the shelves. Now, you're delving into the fascinating world of fermentation, a medieval magic trick turning simple foods into lasting staples. Imagine a cool, dark corner filled with crockery bubbling quietly, where the invisible army of microbes works overtime, transforming cabbage into sauerkraut or milk into tangy cheese. Fermentation was everywhere in medieval kitchens because it preserved food, enhanced nutrition, and improved flavor. Without refrigeration, this natural process turned perishable vegetables, dairy, and even grains into edible treasures that could survive the harsh months. You reach for a wooden ladle and dip it into a barrel of sauerkraut. Its sharp, sour scent fills your nostrils like a crisp autumn breeze. Historians still argue whether fermentation was a universal practice among peasants or more common in certain regions like Germany and Scandinavia, where cabbage and dairy were dietary staples. Regardless, it was undeniably one of the oldest and most reliable preservation methods available. The science behind fermentation is pretty cool. Friendly bacteria and yeasts break down sugars in food, producing acids and alcohol that kill off harmful pathogens. Medieval people, of course, didn't understand microbiology, but they knew fermentation was a secret weapon against spoilage and starvation. They passed down recipes like treasured family heirlooms. Quirky tidbit alert. Some fermented foods were believed to have magical or medicinal properties. For example, mead, fermented honey wine, was thought to bring courage and vitality, while fermented milk products like kefir were sometimes used to treat digestive ailments. You can almost hear the local healer chanting over a bubbling pot. Fermentation wasn't limited to food. Ale and beer were also fermented, staple drinks for many medieval folks, especially peasants who couldn't trust the water. The brewing process itself was a kind of preservation, turning grain and water into a mildly alcoholic beverage safe to drink. You notice a jar of pickled onions and another with olives soaking in brine. Pickling is a form of fermentation or preservation in acid or salt solutions, widely used to extend the life of vegetables. Vinegar, made from fermented wine or cider, was essential in these processes and prized in every kitchen. Some medieval recipes even called for marinating meat in vinegar to tenderize and preserve it. Fermented fish sauces, like the garum used in Roman times, had their medieval counterparts, albeit less glamorous, made by mixing fish with salt and letting it rot, in the best way possible. You cringe a little but acknowledge it was a powerful flavor enhancer, a precursor to modern soy sauce or Worcestershire. And here's a fun fact. Medieval monasteries were fermentation hubs. Monks cultivated recipes for cheese, beer, and pickles with religious dedication, refining methods that spread through Europe. Some of today's famous cheeses and ales owe their origins to these monastic kitchens. You glance again at the bubbling barrels and feel a quiet respect for the unseen microbes and the medieval cooks who harnessed their power without microscopes or science labs. It's a reminder that sometimes the best technology is nature itself. With a final sniff of sour cabbage, you turn away from the fermenting pots, your mind buzzing with ancient smells and the ingenuity that kept food and people alive through the centuries. You find yourself drawn to the cool, shadowy cellar beneath the medieval kitchen, where the secrets of underground preservation lie. Here, root cellars and ice pits made the impossible possible, storing fresh food for months without the need for ice boxes or electric humming machines. You run your fingers over the rough stone walls, imagining the chill that seeps through, holding time at bay. Root cellars were essentially nature's refrigerators, dug deep into hillsides or beneath homes with thick walls of stone or timber. Their consistent cool temperature, usually between 32 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 to 4 Celsius, slowed decay and kept hardy vegetables like carrots, turnips, onions, and cabbages crisp and edible through winter's worst moods. You stoop to pick up a basket of turnips, knobbly, earthy, and surprisingly sweet after months underground. This wasn't just about survival, it was about holding on to some semblance of variety when fields lay barren under snow. Historians still argue whether root cellars were a widespread peasant practice or mostly found on wealthier estates, but archaeological evidence shows they were common enough to be essential in medieval food storage. Interestingly, some medieval cellars doubled as cool spots for storing barrels of beer and wine, preventing spoilage while keeping drinks pleasantly cold. You smile, imagining weary peasants stumbling down for a chilly swig after a long day. Now, ice pits were another level of ingenuity. Deep holes lined with straw or sawdust where ice harvested during winter was packed in to last through the warmer months. Ice wasn't just luxury. In some towns, it was a commodity, sold to preserve fish or chill delicacies for the nobility. Of course, the idea of ice for peasants is contentious. Historians still debate how common and accessible these were outside castles and wealthy households. Here's a quirky tidbit for your mental scrapbook. Some medieval people would even bury milk or butter in cool streams or wells to keep them fresh, turning nature itself into a giant refrigerator. This could be a smelly business if done wrong, but it worked surprisingly well in the right conditions. Preserving food underground or in ice pits required constant care, checking for spoilage, rotating stock, and dealing with moisture. Too much dampness and root vegetables would rot. Too dry and they'd shrivel into useless husks. You think of the patience and attention these tasks demanded, almost a meditation in itself. This physical connection to the earth as a source of sustenance and preservation also had symbolic resonance. The root cellar was a kind of womb, nurturing life through cold, dark months, holding hope until spring's renewal. That feeling of hunkering down and trusting the earth's embrace is timeless. You leave the cellar behind, your hands still cool from the stone walls, and your mind lingers on the quiet ingenuity of medieval people who preserved their food and their lives without the convenience of modern technology. You realize how every method, from drying to fermenting to cellaring, was a chapter in a long, patient dialogue with nature. With this last glimpse into the medieval kitchen's cold heart, you feel a comforting warmth rise, both from the fire upstairs and from the knowledge that human creativity has always found a way to keep hunger at bay. Now, as the night deepens and your eyelids grow heavy, let your mind drift softly through these ancient kitchens, where flickering firelight dances on stone walls and the scents of smoke, herbs, and fermenting food weave a timeless lullaby. Imagine the slow, deliberate hands turning root vegetables in the cool darkness, the quiet bubbling of sauerkraut barrels, and the sun-dried fruits that cling like memories to wooden racks. Each preservation method whispers stories of resilience, of generations who learned to coax life from nature's gifts without modern comforts. The past folds gently into the present as you rest, comforted by the thought that even in the most humble homes, ingenuity blossomed to keep hunger and hardship at bay. Let the sensory echoes fade like a soft breeze, cool cellars, smoky kitchens, salty pickles, and breathe in the calm. Tomorrow is a new day, but tonight you are cradled by history's quiet, enduring rhythms. Sleep well, knowing that the art of preservation is as much about hope as survival. Sweet dreams.